Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another Star Trek Sunday, and this week I'm going to be taking a look at the Exo-6 1/6 scale Captain Archer figure. Now Enterprise seems to have garnered a pretty rough reputation amongst fans. But I have to be honest, I really like Enterprise, and it's a show that I constantly go back to and revisit quite often, particularly that third and fourth season, which were pretty groundbreaking for the time, and very different to what we'd seen previously. And the focal point of any Star Trek show is always going to be the captain, because it's on their shoulders that the show succeeds or fails. And I have to say, I think Scott Bakula's performance as Captain Archer is really strong, and I think he's an excellent addition to the Star Trek canon, and so I'm absolutely delighted to finally own a 1/6 scale figure of Captain Archer. I never thought this would happen after all these years, and Archer, unlike some of the other captains, didn't benefit from a Playmates 12-inch figure all those years ago, and so for the longest time I felt like I've been missing a crucial piece from my Star Trek action figure collection. But finally, that piece is here. Now, this figure was initially scheduled for release in December of 2022. Of course, that didn't happen. This figure was quite delayed, but it did finally make it into my hands in June of 2023. So I do hope that Exo-6 can get a little bit quicker at getting these figures out, because obviously, on average, I'd have to say you're waiting roughly 9 months between putting down your initial down payment and actually receiving your figure, which is, it's quite a wait, and it's a little bit difficult to forecast how much money you have left in the bank, because these things are not cheap. And so the question is he worth it? Is he worth the wait, and is he worth that money? Well, let's take a look and find out, shall we? Let's start off by taking a look at the packaging. Now, this will probably look familiar to anyone who's seen any of the other Star Trek 1/6 scale figures in this line. The background packaging is pretty nondescript. It's just basically a black void. There's not an awful lot going on here. We do have the Exo-6 logo at the very top. We have the Star Trek logo at the top of the packaging, and this is in a sort of silver foil, which is really nice, very attractive. It catches the light very nicely. As you can see, there's a little bit of lens flare glare on it. And in the top right hand corner, you'll see there is this illustrated image of the captain of that particular show. In this case, of course, it is Captain Archer. I really like this approach. I think this illustrated image is really nicely done. It's very lifelike, but it has that painted quality that's just really fun and evocative. Then on the front of the packaging, of course, we have a photo of the figure itself. We have that upper portrait here, which looks really striking, very nice. And this is a sort of glossy front versus the matte of the black background. And then at the very bottom, of course, we have the details of the character in the box. So this looks really nice. You can put this on display, and this looks pretty good in its own right. And then if we flip the packaging and look at the side panel, we can see that about 2/3 of this packaging is given over to this fantastic illustrated image, which extends round from the front of the packaging to reveal the rest of the cast. And we actually see the Enterprise in the background, and even a Klingon cruiser there as well. I love this artwork. I think it's really nice. It adds a real vibrant splash of colour, and as I said, it's a beautiful image that's been very nicely rendered. So this is really fun to put on display. This looks really nice if you're stacking these up on your shelf. And then on the back of the packaging, we have a list of all the contents that come with this figure. We see an image of those various bits and pieces, and we see a full image of the figure as well. The rest of it is given over to small prints, and there's not an awful lot else going on here. It's mostly a black void, but it looks pretty cool. It's not probably something you're going to want to put on display particularly, but it's, it's quite functional. Of course, this is just a slipcase, though. We can lift this up to reveal the figure underneath, where we see this fantastic window display. There's nothing else really going on in this interior card art. It's basically just a black void wrapped around the entire packaging with some credits on the back of the box, so nothing really to show off here. But the window display is nice. As you can see, this figure is very nicely secured, and it looks really nice in terms of its presentation. So you could put it on display like this if you wanted to, and I think this looks really nice and quite attractive, actually. The first thing I want to comment on about this figure is just what a welcome change of pace this has been to some of my other recent reviews on this scale, because this figure feels really strong and very weighty, and it just feels like a really well constructed, well made figure. So let's start off by taking a look at this head sculpt. Now, for me, I'm super impressed with this head sculpt. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think it's caught the likeness of Scott Bakula really well, and it's very effective. However, I have to say, looking back at this footage, looking at it straight on, it looks a little bit off here, and that's really surprising because in the flesh, when I've got it on display, and I've had it on display for just over a week now, no matter what angle I look at it, it looks really fantastic, and yet somehow it doesn't seem to be translating to the camera lens for some reason. Here it does look a little bit off, so I think on this one you're gonna have to sort of take trust me and take my word for it, because in the flesh this looks a lot better than it appears here on screen, and that's a real curiosity. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's really very good. For me, I actually think it's probably one of the strongest likenesses that Exo-6 have produced thus far, and they've all been pretty solid for my money anyway. But I think this is, definitely one of my favourite sculpts, and I think, the detailing, the skin tone, and the paint taps are all meticulously applied. They look very lifelike and very realistic, and I think they've done a really nice job of it. I really like the tailoring of this figure. I like how the costume sits comfortably on the figure. It isn't too tight, it isn't too baggy, it just fits perfectly. Like, there's a little bit of room to breathe in there, as it should be. I think the material they've chosen is a very thick sort of starch cotton, which works really well. It's very authentic to what we see on screen. I think it looks it looks like it should feel, if that makes sense. It has a nice texture to it, and it's quite stiff and quite robust, which is excellent. Again, the colours, the hues look to be pretty much perfect. I think the shades are exactly right, and for the most part the stitching is very smooth and seamless, and I think it looks really nice. However, there's a couple of things with it I was a little bit surprised by. The first thing is the pips at the top of his uniform there. You can see this is a single plastic piece that has just been stuck on. Now, given what we've seen from Exo-6, I was a little bit surprised because I thought they might have opted for perhaps metal or something a bit more shiny, and maybe they'd even gone so far as to have individual pips sewn into the uniform, whereas this feels a little bit like a retrograde step. Also, whilst I'm really pleased to see all the individual zips replicated on the outfit, most of them actually aren't functional, and that was really disappointing. I was expecting each of these to be able to zip open and have a pocket inside, and I was really hoping for that, and sadly that isn't the case, which obviously isn't authentic because they are working zips in the show, so it's really surprising that Exo-6 didn't go that extra mile here, and it's a little bit disappointing. The central zip does unzip, however, and underneath we can see he has his black tunic, which is great, this black shirt. Now, again, in the show, there's actually individual buttons on his collar and at the top of his shirt there, which hasn't been replicated here, which, again, is a shame, because that's a nice little detail that Exo-6 usually pick up on. What I did like, however, is that when you look underneath this, there is another black shirt, like a t-shirt underneath, or a vest. I think that's really cool. That was unexpected, and that was a detail I hadn't picked up on from the show, so that's really cool that they've done that and gone the extra mile here. For the arm patch, they've opted for a transfer. I think this is perfectly well justified. I think this works really well. It looks really authentic, and I think they've done a nice job. In terms of the scale and size, it all looks pretty much accurate to me, and I've nothing really more to say on it. I think it looks really good. Again, as I said, the overall look of the costume is pretty much perfect. It's just a shame that we have all these zips and they're not functional. If we flip it over, I do like the extra details here. We can see the buttons on the back of his costume, which I think looks really nice. Again, that's a detail that I hadn't picked up on in the show, so really cool to see those buttons added here and those sort of tassels around the waist. This looks really cool. All of the hands are really nicely sculpted, they're quite veiny, they look lifelike, the paint taps look really healthy, and they're very nicely rendered. Now, again, going back to the zips, and I don't mean to keep harking on about this, but you will notice that these zips at the cuff are working, and you can lift these up. Now, again, they don't really serve much of a function, but it's just nice to have the option, and again, it just replicates what we see in the show, and underneath we can see, of course, the black shirt there as well, so it's just a nice little extra. You're not obviously going to have it open like this when you put it on display, but it's nice to know that it's there. And once again, the zip at the cuff of the trouser also works, so you can lift this up as well. Sadly, when you do this, when you lift it up, there's nothing underneath. Now, I don't mind that so much, but what is a little bit disappointing is that when you lift this up, you can see there's no sock, so it's just boot meets leg, which, it's just a little thing. I know I'm nitpicking, but it would have been nice if they'd had socks here. I'm pretty sure they were wearing socks in the show. I could be wrong though. Now the boots are just made and sculpted in that single rubber piece. This sort of takes me back to the Action Men of the 1990s. They're nicely sculpted, they're unique to the show, which is great, but it does feel a little bit like they're lacking a little bit of texture. It would have been nice if these had more of a leathery texture to them than this sort of very stark rubber feel that we're getting. And also, if we look at the soles of the boots, you can see there's absolutely no effort to create any kind of tread whatsoever. Now, I can't tell you whether those whether the boots had tread on them in the show, but I'm willing to guess they probably did. So it's a little bit disappointing to see that these are just completely flat and smooth, and there's no extra detail here, because they have done this on some of their other figures. Articulation wise, he has a ball joint in the top of the neck there, so of course he can do all the things you'd expect him to do when it comes to turning his head all the way around, leaning left and right and nodding it up and down. But let me just say this about this figure: I love the articulation. Everything feels very solid, very smooth and very stiff in a really good way. And again, this is a real nice sign of great quality in this figure. At no point does it feel like it's going to be brittle or break or snap. It just feels very robust and strong. Now, he's also got ball joints in his shoulders, so of course he can lift his arms up and out. There's a complementary bicep swivel up there as well, so he can rotate that arm around. There are double joints at the elbow, so he can get his hands all the way back to his head there. And there is a pin swivel at the wrist as well, so that handle rotates all the way around, and of course it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. There's a ball joint in the upper torso, and there's also articulation at the waist as well, so he has no problems when it comes to moving from side to side. He can lean left and right, and he can bend forwards and backwards a pretty healthy distance as well. And again, this all feels very intuitive, it feels very strong and very sturdy, and you can pretty much hold any of the positions you put him in. There's ball joints in the hips, of course the legs will kick out to the side. They'll also turn at the top. There is a swivel at the top of the thigh there, so you can rotate that leg around. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards. There's a double joint at the knee, so that leg can kick all the way back there, which is fantastic. There is a swivel at the top of the ankle, and then there seems to be a ball joint in the actual ankle itself as well that allows the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, move from side to side, but also pivot left and right as well. In a moment, I'll take a look at all the various accessories that come with this figure, but first I wanted to highlight this display stand. And if it looks familiar, well, that's because we've had it before. In fact, we had it with the motion picture figures. Both Admiral Kirk and Colin R. Spock came with this exact same display stand, and that's a little bit disappointing because I would like these to be much more bespoke to the era or the show or the film that they come from. I do like the idea of utilising the transporter. I think that's really a sound choice. It makes perfect sense why you'd go for that. It'd be better if it lit up. Sadly, it doesn't. But it should feel like it comes from the show. Now, this, to me, is not the Enterprise transporter. Obviously, it was a very different look and design. And so it's a bit strange that we've had this replicated again. Now, obviously, feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm mistaken on that. But this, it just doesn't feel very unique to this show, so I was a little bit surprised to see this. Now, just like the motion picture figures, it does come with this extra alternative cover, which I think is meant to be the transporter beam in mid-flow. Again, it's a nice touch. I personally won't be using this, but again, I'm not sure if this really replicates what we see in Enterprise. Okay, so in terms of accessories, he comes with quite a lot. He has an additional 5 hands, each one specially sculpted to hold his various other bits and pieces, such as his phaser, and of course he also has his phaser holster as well. His tricorder, which comes in 2 parts, and we'll take a closer look at this in a moment. His communicator, of course, and Portos. The addition of Portos is a really nice touch. It's a very specific character thing to the captain, which is fantastic, and it's probably the first time we've had any animal replicated in this series. That being said, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but I'm a little bit disappointed because it is just essentially one piece. It is just obviously a sculpt of Portos the dog. It's nicely painted, and it looks pretty good for what it's worth, but there's no articulation here or anything like that, and part of me kind of was maybe expecting we might get something like that, strangely enough, but no, absolutely not. This is just essentially a statue. His phaser holster is quite flimsy plastic, actually. That's a little bit disappointing. It feels quite hollow and a bit on the cheaper side, which is a shame, but it does have this tag at the back, and you can slide it in very neatly into these two grooves that have been created on the pants, so it does fit nice and snug, and it works pretty effectively actually, and it looks pretty good, and again pretty much mirrors what we see on the show, so I think they've done actually a nice job of this. Now the phaser fits very snugly into it as well, and it looks pretty good when it's in place. I really like the communicator. There's not an awful lot of detail on this prop, but what is there is very accurate to what we see on screen. I think they've done a nice job of it. Now, what's really cool is that it actually does flip up, and underneath we can see extra detailing, which is very nicely done through the use of stickers and sculpting and paint, and this is really cool. Likewise, we get two options for the tricorder. We have this folded up version, and we can actually remove the top of that and replace it with the extended tricorder in its stead. And that just slides into place, and again, this has a lot of extra detailing. The paint tabs are very nicely applied. We have a nice sticker on the display there, and this looks really cool. So yeah, this works really well. It's very effective. And as you would hope, he has no problems holding any of these props. As I said, each of the hands is specially sculpted to be able to hold each one specifically, and they fit very snugly, very tight. There's no danger of these falling out of his grip or not fitting quite right, or you having to bend the fingers or anything like that. They just slot in and they look absolutely fantastic, like they were made to be together, as definitely was the case. These look absolutely fantastic. I love all the detailing on these props, in particular in the phaser, the different colours, the sculpting, all looks pretty much pitch perfect. I really like how he's holding his phaser as well, and of course you can create lots of different dynamic poses and different looks with these various accessories as well, depending on how you choose to stand your figures. The other thing I did want to comment on as well is just again, what a pleasure it is being able to swap out these hands. After having some very recent bad experiences with some of my other 1/6 scale figures, there was always a little bit of trepidation when it comes to swapping things out like hands. There have been bad instances in the past where things are snapped off or felt very, very precarious. With this figure, absolutely no issues whatsoever. They come off and slide on very, very easily, as they should. They fit nice and tight and securely, and everything just flows together very, very nicely. And so there you have it. In terms of my final thoughts, I have to say I'm absolutely delighted with this figure. He's a wonderful addition to this line and to my collection as a whole. I'm a big Archer fan, so maybe I was already halfway there, but I have to say he was absolutely worth the wait, and he was worth every penny as well. This feels like a really nicely made figure. I can't stress that enough. It feels very strong, it feels very sturdy, it feels very smooth when you're moving the figure. At no point do you feel like you're going to break this figure, but he still feels like tremendous quality, like a real high-end figure should. He looks fantastic. I really like this head sculpt, although admittedly I have to say, looking back at some of the footage, in some angles it looks a little bit strange, but in the flesh I can only tell you that it looks brilliant. I love the tailoring on the costume, although admittedly again I do have some caveats there around some of the zips and little nitpicks like that, but overall I think this is absolutely fantastic. I think these accessories are really, really fun. They're pretty much pitch perfect. Sure, it would have been nice if we had an articulated Porthos, but you know, really it's just nice to have that, because that's just like a little extra really. It's the icing on the cake, I suppose. The other accessories like the phaser, the tricorder, the communicator are all fantastic and look absolutely brilliant. So I have to say, I think this is a really fantastic figure. Now if you like Captain Archer, if you like Enterprise and you collect 1/6 scale figures, then I heartily recommend you picking this one up. I don't think you'll be disappointed. On the other hand, if you're on the fence, if you're collecting a Star Trek collection but you're not really that into Enterprise per se, perhaps you might want to pick this one up just so you can say you've got all the captains. I definitely think he's worth having. I think he's a really high quality figure and very, very nice. And for me, he's possibly my favourite of all the Exo-6 I have in my collection so far. So that's taking into account the motion picture figures, it's taking into account Q, and even my QMX Picard as well. Although I have to say, I do really love that QMX Picard. All in all, a really nice figure though. I can't recommend it enough. I think they've done a tremendous job, and I have to tip my hat to Exo-6 because they delivered a really fantastic figure. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.